Okay, we're going. All right, folks at home, this is the back half of that sheet that you received yesterday. If for some reason you did not receive that, let me know. We'll scan it off and get it over to you. All right, we were talking today about the European colonization. Now, where these countries went, you should be kind of familiar on a map. You got to know what it was that each country was going after. Spain had one of the biggest land empires in the history of the world. Remember, they had Florida and the Gulf Coast. They had, at one point, everything west of the Mississippi, all the way over to the Pacific, most of Central America, and the western part of South America. The thing they didn't have, we'll just skip down here for is Portugal had Brazil.
Where did that come from?
Nice, okay. The Netherlands had the area where?
New York.
Around New York. Sweden had New Jersey. Okay. And then France at its biggest, now I'm talking about at its biggest, had Canada, the Great Lakes area, and west of the Mississippi, all the way over to the Rocky Mountains. That's from the west of the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, that's the Louisiana Territory. At its biggest, Great Britain, who kicked France out, had Canada, everything east of the Mississippi River. So that's as big and powerful as they got in the New World. And we know that France and Great Britain fought 4 wars for control of the continent. Once those other countries were gone, then it was just down to France and Great Britain along the eastern part of North America. They fought 4 wars. The first 3 had the same pattern. Remember that the British would be moving west and they'd bump into the French somewhere near the Great Lakes. The French would attack those outlying areas, the furthest west the British had gone. The British would then, because their navy was their big weapon, sail over to the St. Lawrence, attack the fortified French towns. Then they'd each grab as much of the other's territory as they could, and then finally they'd give it all back so that they could make peace. It was the 4th War, the French and Indian War, also known as
7-Year War.
the 7 Years' War, that really made the decision that kicked France out. That's the one that was decisive. And it started again in the Ohio River Valley. Now, I'm not going to give you the little details there. If we cover them next week with one of the other review sheets, then you know you'll have to know about George Washington and Fort Necessity and all that. If we don't, you don't. So don't go looking for more information. Remember what we're doing. We're starting off now and ending with our exam. Then you're going to have 2.5 weeks of just getting ready for BAME. Then you're going to have a couple of weeks of Christmas vacation. We're coming back, we'll do a tiny bit of history, but we're going to go right into about 2.5 weeks of studying the Constitution. So it's going to be really more than 2 months before we get back to actually running into the flow of U.S. history. And that's why I want you guys to remember this where we are right now. So we're looking again, big picture thing. Okay, you had your hand up? No?
So BAME, does it teach during Washington?
BAME will what?
Like, will be doing history and BAME still? Like,
Once BAME starts, yes. Okay. What else have we got going here? When you were talking about the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, we talked about the advantages each side had, the French and the British. And I do want you to know those. But more importantly, I want you to understand the concept that any side could win a war, win a battle, win an argument, whatever, if they understand what their advantages are and what the other side's advantages are. Because when you're in any kind of a competition, a basketball game, a field hockey game, whatever, you don't want to play the kind of game that is an advantage for the other side. You want to play the kind of game, you want to fight the kind of war, you want to do whatever it is in the competition. You're going to want to do what's good for you, not what's good for the other side. So each side had some advantages, and William Pitt was the prime minister back then. And he had that 4-step plan to win the French and Indian War. The British didn't really want to fight another war. They just fought 3, got nothing from it, except a lot of expense, a lot of people killed. Well, now William Pitt has to convince them that this is a good idea. 4 steps. Give me one of them. Send troops to help Frederick of Prussia. Remember, Prussia was one of those German states, and he was attacking the border of France. So by sending British troops down there, what William Pitt hoped was that France would take some of the troops they had in Canada and bring them back over to France to defend the mother country. And since he didn't care about France, what he was worried about was capturing North America once and for all. That would be a big advantage for Britain. So that was the first step. Another step. They were going to build up the Navy by, remember, getting the merchants to agree to pay higher taxes. And this is really the critical one as far as studying the American Revolution. So the merchants in Britain would pay higher taxes so they could rebuild the Navy for the French and Indian War. And the deal was, when the war was over, those merchants would become wealthy trading with the colonies. That's why the boycotts that came later worked against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, because those merchants weren't not only becoming rich, they were going broke. Yes, sir. Raise the British morale. How was he going to do that? Making speeches. He was going to pump the British up, let them know we can win this thing. This will be the last one. It'll all be over. Let's get behind it. Yes, ma'am. Right. Send 2 outstanding commanders to America. Remember, the British Army officers thought that the most important officers would be fighting over in Europe because that's where the big war would be in their mind. But William Pitt was concentrating on taking North America, so he said, I can't keep all my best guys here and send the B team. I need to send a couple of the very best officers I have over to the New World. And it was successful. The British won the French and Indian War, and they signed the Treaty of Paris 1763. Remember, you have to add that date because the Treaty of Paris 1763 ends the French and Indian War. Treaty of Paris 1783 ends the American Revolution. So you need to specify which treaty you're talking about. Once the French were kicked out, it became a problem for the British to keep their noses out of everyday affairs in the colonies. They began to mismanage their American empire terribly. First of all, they built up problems with the Indians. Because remember, they took away their guns, the metal hatchets, the metal knives, no more gunpowder, the things that the Indians had become reliant on. Well, most of the Indians already sided with France. Now even some of the ones that had sided with Britain felt betrayed and became a little more antagonistic. There was Pontiac's Rebellion. That was an Indian uprising up near the Great Lakes area. And remember, it was the colonists who fought it. It was the colonists who paid for it. But Britain was afraid with all the debt that she had from those wars with France that she'd have to pay for an Indian war now, a war against the Native Americans. And so they put out a law called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Drew a line right down the top of the Appalachian Mountains and said, okay, if we just keep all the European people, all the English guys over east of the Appalachian Mountains and all the Native American guys over west of the Appalachian Mountains, they can't possibly have an expensive war because there's a mountain range in between them. Yeah.
How do you spell the name of the mountain?
Capital Appialachia. Did I get that right? Yes, sir.
And you said the name is on the east of the mountain?
No, that's the coast. The Europeans are on the east side. The natives are on the west side. Okay. Now they have all these wars to pay for. And the British government said, well, who can we charge? We can't do the merchants again because they already were paying higher taxes so we could win the war. But we could tax the American colonists because we haven't allowed them to vote. They don't have any representation in Parliament. They don't help make the laws. They don't vote for us. So we can charge them taxes and they can't do anything to us if we do that. So the first time they tried this, the colonists immediately came up with their idea of how wrong this was with that slogan, taxation without representation is tyranny. Because the British didn't give them any say in government, the fact that they were charging them taxes and taking their property, their money, that was like theft as far as the Americans were concerned. They said that's tyranny, that's dictatorship, that's being bullies, turning us into slaves. All right, the first taxes the British put on was the Stamp Act. That was an external tax. And what do we mean by that? It goes on top of the price. It's added to it, like a sales tax would be now. And the colonists reacted for the first time together. they called the Stamp Act Congress. Up until this time, each colony dealt with England by itself. They each felt they had a relationship to Britain, but they didn't really have a relationship with each other. So now this is the first time they're working together, the Stamp Act Congress, and they decide the proper course of action is a boycott, to refuse to do any trading with Britain. And here you have those merchants who were promised that they would become wealthy after they paid the taxes for the French and Indian War. So they paid them. Now here you are a few years later, and they're going broke because the colonists won't buy anything. So it's effective, the Stamp Act is removed. Next, the British government comes up with the Townshend Acts. That's an internal tax. They hide the tax inside the price of the goods, thinking that they can nod, nod, wink, wink, fool the colonists. They're just too stupid to understand this fancy finance. And the colonists, of course, immediately know what's going on, and they organize another boycott. Again, the merchants feel the heat of it. They can vote over there in England, and so they put pressure on Parliament. All of the Townshend Acts are repealed except for the tax on what? Tea. Except for the tax on tea. All right, the Boston Massacre. Somebody run me through the Boston Massacre. Go ahead, hon.
So England sent two people, or like, and one of them was Sam Adams.
Well, Sam, he was extreme. He wasn't crazy. Right? Sam Adams was extreme, but what happened with the Boston Massacre?
We started on snowballs.
Who's they?
The colonists started on snowballs at.
Even more specific than the colonists? Patriots, okay, the guys that were on the side of the rebellion. Go ahead.
We threw snowballs at the British Guards, and the British Guards weren't allowed to kill the colonists, and then they kind of ditched that rule, and then they were going to.
Well, it was just one shot at first because remember the soldiers were being backed up against the walls of the customs house where they collected the taxes, and it was getting to be a bit of a panic. The people were throwing snowballs, ice balls, insults at them, and then one soldier fired, and then the rest fired, and 5 colonists were killed, and that became the massacre, the Boston Massacre, because Sam Adams was, hang on, what do you call that word? Where you keep things spinning all the time? He was a radical, that means he's extreme, but one of those people that keeps things always stirred up. Remember, that's what he was. He was an agitator. He was an agitator. Yes, sweetheart.
Do we know which side shot first, or which?
No, I think that was a British soldier fired first. Okay, we don't know at Lexington. Okay. So again, hard feelings. Some people are won over to the American side, to the Patriot side, because of the Boston Massacre, the way Sam Adams portrayed it. They give resistance. We're not going to pay these taxes. It turns into a rebellion, a conflict that gets pretty serious, beginning with the Boston Tea Party. Okay, what happened to the Boston Tea Party? Oh, fill me in here, hon.
The Sons of Liberty went onto a British ship that was doing and it was like 20 or 30 days.
What?
There's a certain amount of days that if the ship isn't unloaded, then a British soldier will come and unload it.
Okay, hang on just a second, just so you can hear it on the video recording. The tea ships came in, ships were bearing tea, and they had 20 days to unload them before the government would come in, the soldiers would unload it. Go ahead.
And the Sons of Liberty didn't, well, the Patriots didn't want it to be unloaded because then they'd have to pay the tax for the tea. They didn't want it to be unloaded after 20 days either, it's going to be auctioned off and still going to pay taxes. So then, on the last night before he unloaded, they went onto the ship and quickly dumped it onto the bottom.
Okay, so if the tea were to be unloaded, then the tax would be paid because they would auction it off and the first money would go to pay the tax. Sons of Liberty did not want that to happen, so they wouldn't wait the 20 days. They waited as close as possible, then they went on board the tea ships, broke open the packaging, threw the tea into the harbor, destroying it rather than letting it come ashore and the tax be paid. Okay, very good. And of course, the British were furious with this, and they put on the Coercive Act, also known as the Intolerable Act, as a punishment for the Boston Tea Party. Give me one of those. Massachusetts Government Act, the British government suspended the elected government of Massachusetts. The colonists had voted for people to represent them, and the British government said, nope, they can't even get in a room together. Thanks. Okay, they closed up Boston Harbor, the Boston Port Act. They closed Boston Harbor and said, no, you can't ship in or out. This port is just closed. And that was the lifeblood of Boston. That was meant to kill the city until the tea was paid for. And when was it paid for again? Never. We had a revolution. Okay, give me another one. Huh? The Quartering Act. What happened there? Exactly. British soldiers were housed in colonist homes. Didn't matter what side politically a person was on. So if somebody were a patriot and they had to have British soldiers living with them, that would be pretty awful. Even if you weren't a patriot, if you were a loyalist, not sure you want people living with you for some indefinite amount of time that you don't have a choice of who it is. Go ahead, buddy. Another one? The Administration of Justice Act, that was a big one. Remember, any British soldier who was charged with a crime would have his trial over in England or in a different colony. And because it was so expensive and inconvenient to travel, after that, the witnesses, the victim would not show up at trials. So after they passed the Administration of Justice Act, 0 British soldiers were found guilty of crimes against colonists. Another one. The Quebec Act. The British government expanded the boundaries of Quebec down around the Great Lakes, just so those colonies that were giving them trouble would not be able to expand. That's what they wanted to do. So they put that under the control of Quebec. Okay, another one? Come on, what's the 6th one, Rehan? I'll mess with you if there isn't one. Okay, so we've got the coercive acts. Eventually, it comes to shooting. The Patriots start gathering the weapons of war: gunpowder, muskets, swords, saddles, whatever they're going to need. They can't store them in Boston because there's so many British soldiers there. So they put them out at Concord, a little town a few miles out. The British march out to grab the weapons. Also, John Hancock and Sam Adams, some Patriot leaders, are out there. And as they come out, they stop at the little town of Lexington, where a few Minutemen have gathered and are standing defiantly. Well, this is the British Army, and there are hundreds of them. They simply brush those guys aside. They shoot. Nobody's sure which fired first, but this was not really a battle. The British just moved, the Minutemen. They marched out to Concord, but word had been brought already. The supplies and the Patriot leaders were gone. Who was it that made it all the way out to give the word? Oh, hand up, hand down. Okay.
Dr. Samuel Prescott.
Dr. Samuel Prescott. Who else did it? Tried to do it. Paul Revere. Anybody remember the third guy? William Dawes. William Dawes. Good. Okay. So you have these guys out in Concord, and now they have to come back. It was unsuccessful. They didn't get anything in their raid. As they march back, their column of soldiers is shot to pieces by the Minutemen. First of all, who were Minutemen? Really? Right. The farmers who were on the Patriot side, they said they'd be ready in a minute to come out and fight. They did. How did they fight differently than the British Army? What did they do?
They probably like shoot and run.
Yeah, they'd shoot and run. What the British Army did over in Europe against the French or the Spanish, the Dutch or the Portuguese was they stood shoulder to shoulder, all aimed their muskets and fired at another line of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. That's the way they know how to fight. And here the Americans, they hide behind a rock or a tree, they shoot into the column of soldiers, wound or kill a couple of people, they run off. They reload and they pop up behind another rock or tree and shoot some more soldiers. And the British don't know how to fight this way. They can't react to this. So their column is just shrinking as they're marching back to Boston. It was a terrible defeat. They run back under the protection of the British naval guns in the harbor, but they're bottled up now. They don't. All those guys with the guns that hide behind rocks and trees are out there, and they don't know how to fight them. Yes, sir. Oh, the Minutemen won, very definitely. All right. So we've got shooting happening, and the Americans try one more time for peace. What was the name of the document? Anybody remember who wrote it? John Dickinson, okay, a member of the Second Continental Congress. He said, look, we're shooting each other. Please, please, one more time. Can't we try to make peace without this turning into a full-fledged war? But the king was angry. No, there was going to be a war. The Americans were smart enough to realize, okay, the British have this massive empire, this huge war chest. They've got an immense army, the biggest navy in the world. If we're going to do anything, we better do it right now before all those people come over. So the Patriots took the offensive first. Question, man? So Dickinson, capital Dickinson, capital Dickinson. And for a couple of you, John is John. It's fairly commonly misspelled. For some reason, people really like Jhon.
Hi, I have a question for you. Is there a better time?
Yes.
You have like 3 months.
Yes, happy to lunch.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. So they take the offensive. Bunker Hill. Tell me what happened there. Okay. Hit me.
There was a battle fought on Breed's Hill.
Fought on Breed's Hill. Good.
The Patriots had fortified it in the trenches and all that. And the Patriot was commander told them to not shoot until they could see the whites of the bird's eyes because they have limited ammunition to all different guns. So it's hard to supply.
Okay, excellent. So the Americans were on top of the hill. It was Breed's Hill, even though it's called Bunker Hill, because that was a landmark. And as the British marched up, the Americans waited till the very last minute. Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes to fire down on the British. Each side claimed victory. Why? Z.
The British won the Battle of Breed's Hill.
Sorry, I don't know how to get rid of that. Okay, let's do that.
The British won the Battle of Breed's Hill, but the Patriots only had 400 from the return to
Right. So the Americans claimed victory because they said we gave more than twice as many casualties to the British. Remember, a casualty is a soldier who's either killed or wounded so badly he cannot continue to fight. But the British claimed victory because they took the hill. They knocked the Patriots off. So each side claimed victory there, but again, it wasn't a clear victory. So the British lost coming back from Concord. Now they arguably lost at Bunker Hill. What happened at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point? All right, give me a little information there, buddy.
Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys took Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point.
Those were 2 forts, Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys took them. What were they after?
Cannons.
Cannons. Where were they going to put the cannons? Ryan.
Boston.
To Boston. Remember, the British Army is hiding in Boston because the Minutemen chased them in. And the British Army has the equipment of an army. They have cannons. The Americans don't. They've got a bunch of farmers with guns. So it's really important for them to get the bigger guns of war, the cannons, from the forts up on Lake Champlain, get them over there. When they do come, George Washington puts them where? On Dorchester Heights, an elevated area above the city, so he can shoot the British. The British can't hit him back. So Boston is going to have to be abandoned. All right, so we have a couple more disastrous battles for the British. Then, when George Washington takes command, he gets the cannon, he puts them up on Dorchester Heights, and which British general has to abandon the city of Boston?
Benedict Arnold.
No.
No.
General Howe does. Okay, and the flow of the war. What happens during the war? And again, this is really big picture stuff. It starts off in New England. I mean, New England is where you have Bunker Hill and Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, the city of Boston, the retreat from Concord. That's all happening up in the Northeast, up in New England. Well, the British begin there, but then they do that thing of looking at what are our advantages. What kind of a war do we want to fight? Do we want to fight in a silly little hill in Boston? Do we want to march back from a farm community? No, we have a lot of people. We have enough to mount 3 expeditions. One to Quebec, one to New York City, one to Charleston. Pronounced out?
Wow.
Charleston, thank you. Okay. The one going to Charleston is an American victory because the British can't figure out how to defeat that fort made out of palmetto logs. What's the story with the palmetto logs? Somebody there, hit me.
So like the palmetto logs, like when you shoot
it doesn't break it, it vibrates because it's such a wet wood, it's so pliable, it's so bendable. So the British give up on that, sail up. New York City, General Howe does capture it. Which American general does he defeat? Elizabeth, that'd be a British general. Which- Which American general? I'll give you a clue. He can't on the $1 bill. Okay, yeah. George Washington is defeated a couple of times, has to abandon New York City, and then, is everybody here taking the test? Anybody not taking it? Okay, when I asked you what advantage would the British gain by taking New York, lots of you said winter quarters. That's the advantage they would gain by taking New York City. I said New York, the whole colony. That would be to cut New England off from the rest of the colony. Okay, and then the third expedition went to Quebec, and that is General Arnold was chased off. He and who was the other commander that was up there? No, that was later. Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold had surrounded the British town of Quebec, and when this expedition showed up, the soldiers on the expedition started to surround the American army, which meant they would have British soldiers in front of them inside Quebec and behind them because they'd been surrounded. So they were smart enough to get out of there and come back down to the colonies. Foreign aid we talked about for the revolution. Now, again, on your test, I said specifically foreign individuals, and some people put down France, Spain, Holland, or the Netherlands. That's not right. Those aren't individual people. So you could have had something like, there's a long list. You could have used the commanders, de Grasse or Rochambeau. You could have used Lafayette coming over and commanding an American army, von Steuben giving them discipline. You could have said Casimir Pulaski teaching them to ride on horseback, or Thaddeus Kosciuszko designing the fortifications at West Point, Heinz Solomon raising money. And again, he didn't pay for the war. There are a couple that said he paid for the war. Yeah, let me just grab a wallet here, pay for a war. That's a little expensive. He raised money from private people, from other countries, from businesses, any place he could come up with dollars to keep the revolution going. Yes, sir.
I remember the spelling of the
You don't?
Yeah, I mean, if it's O or U.
It's capital P-U-L-A-S-K-I. Correct. What did I say? Capital P-U-L-A-S-K-I. Correct. It's P at the end.
I kind of think like tall.
Okay, there's ethnic information. Do you know that SKY is, or SKI is usually a Polish name? Yes, ski is very much a Polish name. So, Mr. Urbanski is ethnically from a Polish background. Okay, that's a very common thing. Now, Dembski, he's SKE. Are you Polish? Or Polish background?
SKI.
Well, you are SKI.
Yeah.
Okay. Is your ethnic background Polish?
Yeah, Polish and German.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. Common enemy.
I like that.
Okay, so let's see here. Then we talked about the foreign aid to give the individuals there. We got the government secretly giving it at the start. The three-pronged attack on New York. The British said, okay, we just haven't had any success up here, so let's isolate New England and conquer them. We'll just concentrate. We'll cut them off from the rest of the colonies. And this was Johnny Burgoyne's plan. He was going to come from the north down Lake Champlain. General Howe, who just captured New York, was supposed to come up the Hudson River, and then Colonel Barry St. Ledger was supposed to come down the Mohawk River, all three of them meeting at the city of Albany. What actually happened, though, of course, was Burgoyne was forced to surrender at the Battle of Saratoga. General Howe decided he needed not to give all the credit to Burgoyne, he needed some for himself, so he was going to go capture Philadelphia. But when he rode his army out on the ships, they were becalmed for 33 days, and he still went down and captured Philadelphia. But it took him so long to do all of that, when he came up to help Burgoyne, Burgoyne had already surrendered. And then Barry St. Ledger, coming with his 1,000 Indians and 200 British soldiers down the Mohawk River Valley, he was turned around after the Battle of Oriskany, mostly because his Native American helpers had run off because of the business with the loyalist brother who wasn't very bright and had been convinced that this was a big attack and a trap by the Americans to crush the British. Okay, the war at sea. Who do we love?
John Paul Jones.
Oh yeah, you gotta love John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, nice story. He's a guy you should know. But the big thing was, at sea, the British used the blockade. They put their ships around the strategic ports to keep things from going into or coming out of the United States. And the Americans, because they had really almost no navy, used privateers. They hired private ships, gave them letters of marque, remember spelled M-A-R-Q-U-E, so that they could officially wage war on behalf of the United States. Well, the British said, okay, let's try another strategy. Let's go down to the bottom and come up, because we figure the Southerners will be more sympathetic to us, till there's just New England left. And they did well. They took Savannah in Georgia. They took Charleston in South Carolina. But just north of there, they ran into Francis Marion, the swamp fox. And he slowed them down fighting what kind of warfare? Guerrilla warfare, which means what? Yep, he'd do little raids and go hide back in the swamp. And he didn't have enough soldiers to go fight the British Army in a battle, so it was just little raids, but it annoyed the bejeebers out of the British. And then finally, Lord Cornwallis is coming up the coast. He says, we'll leave that behind. I'm just going to keep going with my conquest of the colonies. And he moves up the coast with Lafayette's American army next to him. When they get a little further north, Lafayette says, hey, if I can get George Washington's American army and Rochambeau's French army down here at the same time, we can beat this guy. We'll have more people. Cornwallis is a smart general. He goes down onto Yorktown Peninsula, expecting to be surrounded by the British Navy, where he's going to put his soldiers, then they're going to sail away to fight another day. But instead, it's the French Navy, because Admiral de Grasse had come across, and he was having a few extra days, and he asked Washington, could I do anything for you? Washington said, put the French Navy around this guy. They did. Cornwallis was completely surrounded, forced to surrender. That was the last big battle of the war. But it did take a little while longer, more than a year, to finish it up, to sign the Treaty of Paris 1783. Now, the Treaty of Paris 1783, don't forget you have to have the date, because this is the one that ends the American Revolution, made us a new nation. That is, we were recognized by the British as a new nation. The French had already recognized us. We already declared ourselves independent. The first government was the Articles of Confederation, a loosely formed alliance, very ineffective. The only good law was the Northwest Ordinance, which said that all that new territory we have, because the British gave us all the way over to the Mississippi, all that new territory we have, that can become states equal to the original states. And remember the conditions they had to have? They had to have a reasonable boundary, a reasonable population, they had to have a republican form of government, and they had to ask. Then they could become a state equal to one of the original states. Okay. Any questions on that? Yes, sir. This is what it is. It was a loosely formed alliance. It was a very weak central government. They just fought a war against the strong central government, the British. They didn't want to make their own strong government. They might have to fight. Okay. Let me just turn off the video. That was kind of fun.